Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Today I am here to give you something somewhere between a rant and a lesson on journalistic integrity or the lack thereof, lying with statistics, and how to misrepresent scientific experts. So, today I was shown an article with the headline, "Carbon footprint of homegrown food 5 times greater than those grown with conventional agriculture." Now, that seems a bit counterintuitive on the face of it to anyone who has ever done backyard gardening, where you say to yourself, but wait, how is the carbon footprint of me putting a pepper plant from the farmer's market in my backyard and then harvesting several pecks worth of peppers, for pickling if desired, throughout the course of the season, greater than the carbon footprint required to grow them somewhere completely different in the world, ship them to a processing plant in a different part of the world, ship them to a distribution center from where they will go to a grocery store from where I will pick them up and bring them home, significantly less flavorful, further into their lifespan, and less tasty. Well, the answer is, it's not true. That is, let's say, a misrepresentation. You see, I saw this and I thought it was dubious and decided to fact check it, which I did because they had helpfully named the first author of the paper. So I went and looked at the paper that they were theoretically summarizing for you, the consumer of news. It is available online, or at least their methodology, data, etc. is available online. I will put a link in the video description. So, here's the thing. The question that this study was actually asking is a reasonable one, and it is based in the field of climate science, where people are continually looking for ways to lower the carbon footprint of humanity so that we don't bake the planet to the point where we can't easily live on it. Earth will still be here, we just won't be welcome. So, within that field, they said, well, wait a minute, there's an assumption that hasn't been examined properly, which is that if we all were to transition to building community gardens tomorrow and shorten the food chain in this fashion, would that actually have a net positive effect on carbon emissions? I know it seems obvious on the face of it, but let's actually do the study. This is a reasonable thing to do in science. You verify your assumptions. So, what they did was not an apples to apples comparison. For the community gardens, first of all, what they were examining was exclusively what they called low-tech urban agriculture. Low-tech meaning we're not looking at things like aquaculture, we're not looking at things like vertical farming, we're not looking at solar capture, we're just looking at like fairly standard planted in the dirt in the ground, maybe in a raised bed, and get food out of it. So they looked at several different categories, ranging from urban farms, where you literally buy a lot in a city and build a small farm on it using more or less conventional farming techniques applied on a smaller scale, generally with some intercropping, to community gardens, where you have people in the community come together, build a garden on an empty plot of land in the neighborhood, and all work to grow and harvest together, all the way down to backyard food production. Oh. Stick a pin in the question of backyard food production, because literally everything I'm about to say, they explicitly said, note that this is slightly different for things like backyard gardens. We discussed this elsewhere. So those should largely be kept out of this conversation, which, by the way, means that on the face of it, the headline was misleading at best. This was not an apples-to-apples comparison between low-tech urban agriculture and existing conventional agriculture via megafarm, because they looked at the total carbon footprint starting from nothing. That means you have to buy the equipment. You have to have it shipped to you. You have to have it manufactured somewhere. The parts have to be manufactured somewhere and then shipped to the assembly plant. And all of that was baked into the estimates of the carbon cost of the initial farm and or garden or what have you, along with the comparable costs of any lumber that was used to make the beds, concrete that was used to make the paths, etc. They then baked that starting cost into the total produce that was extracted from this agricultural area, to use sort of their terminology, and worked out over the projected probable lifespan, how long did it need to run before you got to the break-even point. Note that there was always a break-even point, by the way. In some cases, it was like almost 100 years in the future, but if you consider something like, I don't know, the medieval commons, 100 years is a lot shorter than those were around before people decided that having things for the common good was less important than having individual ownership and making money off of them. I digress. So, what they did with the comparable volume of food produced via conventional agriculture was look at what are called LCAs, life cycle analyses, which are the industry standard for determining the total carbon cost of something. Now, these are inherently somewhat limited because they have to be scoped. For example, let's talk about growing onions. You have to determine, okay, what are my inputs? I need this amount of water, I need this amount of fertilizer, and I need this amount of pesticide, and I need this amount of seed shipped in. The techniques that I use will have this follow-up environmental cost based on runoff, based on air pollution generated, whatever. And then once it's dug up, it's put in a shipping container, which is trucked to a port, is at the port put on a cargo ship, and is shipped to wherever it's going. So they work out the total cost needed there. But the thing is, they're all based around the life cycle of a specific thing. In this case, it's the onion. And it doesn't take into account what was used to create the agro-business farm that it's on in the first place. Now, for answering the question, should we be replacing what already exists with this new thing from a purely carbon footprint perspective, that is a reasonable thing to do. You're saying maintaining this costs this much total carbon. Building this costs this much total carbon. Okay, but in terms of headlines, you should instead bake in the amount of carbon needed to build the farm and everything on it and transport all of the workers to it and from it, as opposed to this thing that you walk to in your neighborhood. The math starts to work very differently once you do that. So, it was answering a different question than the headline made it sound like it was answering. It explicitly said backyard gardens are kind of anomalous and an exception to this. It also mentioned that in the case of something like a community garden, you get a measurable social and economic good from both additional uses of the infrastructure that you've built, like people playing in the garden and spending time there with their kids and not paying for, I don't know, childcare, that can be measured, and that if the infrastructure use is devoted, I think it was slightly over 90% to other things as well, then suddenly this problem goes away and you hit the break-even point basically immediately. And they went on to say that that may sound like a high number, but in many of the cases they studied, they were already above that threshold of usage dedicated to other things than direct food production using the infrastructure that they had built. So,
like helping people have additional jobs or have more money to spend because they're not spending it on the food, like
right.
having a place to spend their afternoons that is a third place instead of a place you have to spend money to spend time there, like providing jobs for people who can't get jobs elsewhere.
Exactly. So it pays back into the community in ways that you can then kind of measure in terms of carbon if you want to, but are also just additional benefits. There's also an important note to consider here. Here's the thing. This study was answering a legitimate question in terms of creating a replacement. However, trying to then apply this study to say, oh, we would use more carbon to do things this way, so clearly we should stick with what we have, is overlooking a very important and necessary point. Doing things the way that we are doing them is not working. It is causing problems. It is tilting the climate of the planet that we live on and keep all of our stuff on away from human habitability. So, some of the underlying assumptions in the model that they use to measure carbon costs are, example, there will always be a fully loaded container ship traveling from any port to any other port. This means that to get the carbon cost of travel, you just take the ton weight of onions divided by the tonnage of the boat, and then work out the boat's carbon footprint to make that whole trip. That math only works if you always have full cargo ships going to and from every port. This underlying system has failed. It needs to be replaced. There's also, by the way, just a secondary thing. As climate change effects are occurring, places where agribusiness was growing a large amount of food are no longer viable as places to grow a large amount of food. So those baked-in startup costs that you were just ignoring, you suddenly can't ignore anymore. Your massive almond farm in California is now uninsurable because of fire, flood, and disaster due to climate change. You're going to have to shut it down. You're going to have to build a new one somewhere else. Well, suddenly, all of those building carbon costs are back. They weren't in this analysis because that's not the question they were asking. But they're going to have to be in the new analysis of determining if you should build a new one or if you should grow, one, more regionally appropriate crops, and two, in a more distributed, localized fashion. So, there is one other thing that was outside the scope of this study that is important to note. It's only measuring carbon. It's not measuring the way that conventional agriculture has become unsustainable because it has mined all of the nutrients out of the topsoil. And guess what? They can't grow as much in those places anymore. So, the article title is this fear-mongering call to not grow your own food, because that would be bad for the environment. Turns out that's not actually what the study they were basing it on was asking. It's not what the study they were basing it on said, especially in the case of backyard gardens. And it's taking a study that answered a valid question and drawing conclusions from it that you cannot draw from that study, and then sensationalizing them and feeding them to the public, who of course sees that this is based on actual scientific research that was published in the journal Nature and goes, oh my god, I guess I won't make a garden. Bad journalist. I see your agenda. I see your bullshit. Stop it.
No, before you stop, I will also, I'm just going to come on camera.
Yes,
So,
please.
I know he said we'll just touch on this, not at all, because the study itself set it aside, but I want to make a note that if you do go look at what it said about backyard gardening, it essentially said, yeah, there's a carbon footprint attached to getting started. You can offset a lot of that with responsible composting.
Oh, yeah. They basically didn't look at regenerative agriculture practices, composting practices, the food value that you get out of doing a mixed use thing where, for example, you're using garden waste to feed your chickens, or if you scale it up, using farm waste to feed your goats, whatever. That was outside the scope of this.
But they essentially said there are a lot of ways that people offset the carbon footprint of their backyard garden that would be very effective, that we are not looking at and measuring in this study. But other people have found that doing that does offset a lot of the harm of the getting started portion.
Right.
You can also, for example, I only have the one raised bed. I've not been happy with it. I intend to deconstruct it. I built it out of scrap wood from our property, but additionally, you could just not do like galvanized steel raised bed. You could do the mound method instead. And then the startup cost is reduced because they took into account the carbon of all that equipment.
Of getting it there.
Right.
So, as long as we're talking about workarounds, there's also an inherent problem with the way that they measured the carbon footprint of the construction materials, which is that it assumed that you bought them at Lowe's or equivalent.
Like Lowe's or Home Depot, which I don't know about other farmers on here or other backyard gardeners. We've bought hardly anything. Everything has been given to us in community exchanges or we've salvaged.
Right. The fact of the matter is, one, if you go and talk to a local construction company and ask them for some of their leftover concrete, they may just give it to you. And oh, look, that carbon cost was baked into a different project. Two, you can in fact argue that this is an argument in favor of localizing supply chains for things like building material, timber, etc., rather than an argument for why you shouldn't localize your food production. Three, communities gift and reuse and repurpose. If you're using Walmart's used pallets that they were going to throw away, that you have stripped the nails out of with community labor and built whatever structures you needed out of, that's a carbon cost that was already paid elsewhere. It's zero for you.
So, if you are concerned about it, there are totally very simple ways to offset it and not have that impact. Okay?
Okay. See you all next time. Be safe out there, everybody.